Alright, mother truckers. The question was about abortion, particularly about conservative views on abortion and my thoughts. And I've talked about abortion for like hours before, so this is going to be pretty boring to kind of flesh all of that out. But on what you mentioned, something I can point out is that conservatives, the intellectual conservatives, they have a tendency to see the world in a black and white kind of way, which is good in many contexts and many situations. And what I mean is someone like, if you imagine Judge Judy, like that's the kind of logic and the kind of behavior and the kind of values that they hold in a very large way. Things have to make sense, and I think they have a real strong need for things to make sense logically and to act on the basis of the logical conclusions that they come to. But I think they have a very, very rigid senses. They need to be able to organize the world very rigidly for them to be able to make sense of it. And sometimes, or at least I would say a lot of times, the world is not rigid. It's not, you can't categorize it into neat little boxes. And the world is almost never black and white. And I think that's, in a way, their downfall and why they don't make sense, or they don't make as much sense as they like to feel like they do, and they don't. They're not as factually and logically consistent as they like to be perceived to be, or like to have people perceive them as. Because I think at core, many of the beliefs that they have are based in ethics that are subjective, that are based on maybe their religious belief, which I don't think any particular self-respecting religious politician or someone involved in politics would use a religious text in itself to justify something. But you get my point. So it's very kind of black and white. They want to be able to say, this is right, this is wrong, this is bad, this is good, this is true, this is false. And so it's very black and white. And a lot of people see the world that way, and it works for them. And honestly, those are the kind of people that would get shit going and make things happen. That's kind of thinking that is efficient and is effective. But it's also ruthless, and it's also lacking in nuance, and it's also not how you want to be thinking when you actually want to understand something in depth. It's the mindset you need to have when you're trying to accomplish, when you're trying to organize, when you're trying to get shit done. So I just want to keep that in mind. And next to that, they tend to have, especially with this topic, a sense of moral absolutism. And the moral absolutism and the logic that they tend to go to is a human fetus is a life. I don't know what justification or definition they may have for life. It probably stems from a religious belief in I think it's a religious belief that the soul or the life begins at conception. And because a human is a life, then terminating that life is murder. And murder is bad because, religious values, murder is bad. And so having an abortion is murder, therefore having an abortion is bad. That's typically, and I don't want to look like I'm misrepresenting anyone, that's just the general gist of what I have taken in before when I've heard people like Crowder and Ben Shapiro. And yeah, so that makes sense. It makes logical sense. It's very smooth logic, right? A fetus is alive. You take away a life. You murdered that life. Therefore, you're a murderer. And the problem here is that, like I said, the world is almost never black and white. So that doesn't actually make as much sense as you'd think it does. And I think it's actually a flaw in a lot of people's arguments who are emotionally attached to an argument, who are trying to justify their emotional position with logic and rationale. And it's something that fanatics do all the fucking time. And by fanatics, people that come to mind are certain vegans, certain feminists. I don't mean feminists or vegans are fanatics as a whole, but particular ones. There's a tendency for people with ideologies that tell you that your values are better than everyone else's, for them to have a certain amount of greater than thou attitude. Some people who are religious as well, there's a certain amount of holier than thou attitude and a large amount of this thing makes so much sense, there's so much logic behind this, how could you not understand it, kind of thing. And it's an emotional position, because most people who are vegan because of an emotional reason, because they think it's wrong what we do to animals. And most people who are religious because they grew up that way, and it was the place they belonged, so they're very defensive and emotionally attached to that thing. If they're honest, the reason they're there is not because of a purely logical conviction. The reason they're there and the reason they care so much and the reason they're arguing so much is because it's an ethical or a value-based or a feeling-based thing that they're defending. And so they're defending it so staunchly. And because a lot of these conservatives that you're talking about are so intellectually inclined, they will defend their feelings with logic, which is common. I mean, I do it too, and I've done it before. I defend the things that I believe in and things that I feel about by explaining how darn logical they are and how much they make sense. But that aside, I want to go and explain why the moral absolutism and why the rigid logic doesn't make sense. And I will say the first reason is because that line of logic is enclosed. So it is life, you take away life, it becomes murder. Murder is bad, therefore abortion is bad. But that same conservative, if you asked them if a soldier in the US military was a murderer, I don't think they would say yes. And if you ask them, is what the soldier doing murder, I don't think they would say yes, even though they're taking a life of a human for, you could argue, no good reason, for, supposedly protecting our freedoms and rights, but most likely because they were poor kids who couldn't find another way in life, and they ended up in the military fighting wars for corrupt politicians and their agendas. So they killed another person. Was that murder? I don't think they would consider it murder. I don't think conservatives would see that in the context of that and consider it murder. So why is that? They would say it's a different context. And I want to point out something as well, that most people, when they think of abortion, they don't think of murder. Because when you think of murder, you think of a certain context. I just want to point that out. That's a tangent though. But here, when you talk about a soldier, a conservative would probably tell you, but context. And yet they don't look at context when it comes to this particular topic of abortion. So let's think of something else. Most conservatives that would say they were against abortion would also probably say that if they could go back in time, they would kill baby Hitler. And their justification would be context, right? That baby's going to grow up to be a very evil man and kill so many people. But you're going to go back in time and kill a baby. They didn't do anything yet, but you would do it because context. Context. There is something that you believe is more important than the act of taking a life. And so you probably would not consider that murder in the way that we perceive that word in our minds as a society as such a terrible thing, because the context justifies it. Let's think of another example. I think most conservatives are pro-death penalty. And that is when we take a human life. And you would say, well, context, justification. This person committed a heinous crime, or not even committed a heinous crime, was declared by the courts, who could have been right or wrong, that they have declared a heinous crime. And so they deserve it. But that is a human life. You are taking that human life. You are committing murder. And yet most conservatives would not say that the death penalty, that capital punishment, is murder. I don't think they would describe it with that word, because they don't care about people on death row. But they are life. You know, they exist in that context, that framework of that rigid logic. They are life. You took it away. You murdered someone. Murdering someone is bad. Therefore, capital punishment, bad. You know, I could make the same argument, but it's too simplistic. And I think I'm trying to get that to sink in a little bit. And I hope it has. When we kill a animal that's in pain and we euthanize that animal, we are taking a life. But is it murder? Do we say to ourselves and to others that we murdered that dog or that animal? No. We say that we saved it from a life of suffering, because context is important. And I think context is what many conservatives who, with very staunch values and value systems and principles, lack. They lack nuance, they lack context. And they are many times unwilling to perceive context in things and aspects that they are very emotionally attached to, abortion being one of them, because it is related, of course, to their religion, and religion is a very emotionally entrenched thing. All right, so let's get into the context of abortion. Now that we have kind of driven home the point that when people think of murder, they think of a particular context in a person, I think the reason a lot of people don't think of murder when they see a woman having an abortion is because we think of murder in certain contexts, and the context of those women does not seem to fit the concept of murder in our minds, in the same way that capital punishment or someone in the military or euthanizing a dog would not be considered murder to, I'm assuming, most of those conservatives, or killing baby Hitler. But here's the thing. When people have an abortion, I don't think anyone in this world agrees that abortion is a great thing, that it's a lovely, wonderful experience that we should all have. I don't think anyone is pro-abortion. I don't think anyone wants to see their loved one have to go through that. I don't think anyone wants to go through that themselves. I don't think anyone is pro-abortion. And I can agree with a lot of conservatives in that I wish abortions didn't happen. I wish we lived in a society where abortions didn't need to happen, because people were more financially stable, because people did not rape or have incest. And I know that's only 1% or something of the number of people who have abortions, but I wish we lived in a society where more people were educated about proper use of contraception. I wish people were more financially stable. I wish people were in more long-term committed relationships with one another, where having a child would not have been a mistake, would not have been something they wouldn't be able to deal with. I wish less men left after getting someone pregnant. I wish there was less promiscuous sex in society without proper education or use of contraception. I wish that society was better and that abortions happened less. I wish people had more foresight in their decisions that they made in their lives. I wish, right? And so I can agree with you on that. And I think a lot of people can agree that abortion is a bad thing. It's a sad thing. The question is not, is abortion a bad thing or a sad thing? But should we criminalize the act of abortion? Should we make it illegal? Should we make there be punishment of a fine or jail time for it? Because on one level, the demand for something will never go away, in the sense that there are a lot of things we prohibited in the past. We prohibited alcohol. You can prohibit prostitution. You can prohibit a lot of things. It doesn't mean the demand for it will ever go away. And a question that you also need to ask yourself is, if someone's going to get an abortion either way, would you rather that they went to a doctor and did it safely, or would you rather they used a coat hanger and threw themselves down a flight of stairs? That's a tangent, but something to think about. I'm thinking there are other things to take in mind as well. If you're not religious and if you're not arguing on religious terms, then you're probably not thinking of a soul, and you're probably not thinking that murder in all contexts is bad, given the examples that I've given. Ending life is not always bad. And I want you to think of the dog that you ended their suffering. And I know that many conservatives actually grew up in very good homes with very good families. Which, it may be a wrong thought, but it seems to be that way to me. And I don't think they're very in touch or realize what it means to grow up thrown around in a foster system, or to grow up being unloved and considered a mistake by your mother, or to grow up without a father because they left, or to grow up in a situation that was not financially stable, where the people that were raising him were not emotionally available. I don't think they know too much how that feels, to grow up abused, to grow up unloved, to grow up ignored, to grow up neglected, to grow up being thrown around in the foster system between family and family that are only there because of the money the government pays them, who only take them in not because they love them, not because they care, but because it's the equivalent of a welfare check. I don't think people know how much children suffer sometimes if they haven't had those experiences themselves. And I want you to think of the dog that you put out of their suffering and their misery. And I want you to think of a kid that would be born to a woman that was willing to end their life because they felt they were a mistake, or because they felt that they couldn't viably provide financially for that kid, or that they couldn't emotionally provide for that kid, or because their father left and wouldn't be there. A child that would be born, made fun of, and humiliated for being a product of rape or incest, or that would remind their parent of their rapist every single day of their life, growing up hated and despised for no fault of their own. I want you to think what kind of life that kid grew up to have. And we know that people that grow up in broken homes with single mother tend to be more violent, tend to commit more crimes, tend to be more likely to drop out of high school, they were born without a chance in life, without a real chance in life, because they didn't have people who loved them. They didn't have financial stability. They didn't have emotional stability. They didn't have people that cared about them. And I don't know if you know how it's like to live that way. But it's terrible. And I want you to think of the dog that is suffering. And I want you to think to yourself, if you could prevent a kid from suffering that way, wouldn't that be benevolent and kind thing to do? Wouldn't it be kind to end their life there? That's a question that you should ask yourself, especially since those conservatives will say, I am not responsible to take care of the mistakes of other people. I am not responsible to pay money into systems or programs to help these children once they're born. I am just fighting for their rights because I believe murder equals bad. Which is a point of view. But I don't even think programs can really take the position of family or a good family. I don't think government can or state can fill that role. At least I haven't seen it fill that role very well. What I want to say is there is immense suffering that comes from a kid being born in that kind of situation where they're unwanted, unloved, considered a mistake, in a situation where they were not financially provided for or emotionally provided for, and essentially they never had a chance in life. And that's a very real thing. You can say, well, you never know, he could be the next Einstein. Well, he could be the next Hitler too. You will say, well, God will provide for him. Well, statistically, people who are born in certain situations, dire situations, tend to stay that way throughout their life, and they tend to lead very miserable lives. I am asking you if you could end that and cut it short at the very start, if you could save that person all that pain, wouldn't you? Wouldn't you? And wouldn't that be a benevolent, kind thing? That is one thing to think about. Another thing to think about is pain, and I don't know actually the answer to this, but since I'm not religious and I don't believe in a soul and I don't believe it is inherently wrong to sorry, let me look this up. Does a fetus feel pain? And since I don't necessarily believe that taking life is always a terrible and bad thing, given context, forget what I was saying. Oh, because I don't believe in a soul, what really matters to me is, can that fetus feel pain? Can that fetus feel? Because I think at some point they say the fetus has not yet developed a nervous system and thus does not have the sentience in which they feel pain. Unborn children have a capacity to feel pain much earlier. The neural circuitry responsible for the most primitive response to pain, the spinal reflex, is in place by 8 weeks of development. This is the earliest point at which the fetus experiences pain in any capacity. Okay. 8 weeks, huh? That's it. That's interesting. So if that's true, and I don't know if it is, I'd have to read some more about it, then I would totally be, I would have no problem with aborting fetuses before 8 weeks, because they can't feel pain, even as a spinal reflex kind of pain, and that's not even the pain that we're talking about. But yeah, if that kid can't feel pain and you could end their the potential for all the suffering they'd live throughout their lives by ending it there, why wouldn't you? That is typically how I think about it. And of course, there's much more nuance and much more gray area, and a lot of conservatives think they're fighting for the rights of people who can't speak and people who aren't considered humans. And I would ask those same conservatives why they would reject the idea that vegans have. They say the same things, that they're protecting the rights of those who cannot speak for themselves, and that these animals are considered that they don't matter and they don't count simply because they can't defend themselves. But many conservatives would laugh at a vegan. I guess the difference is religious belief, since religious text would condone, or maybe I don't actually know, but would have examples of, sacrificing animals or slaughtering animals, and would make killing humans considered bad. So I guess it might be ethics obtained from religious belief or text. But I don't know. I think it's a complex thing. It's something you need to think about. Of course, I'd like to live in a world where there was no abortions, but am I ready to make it illegal? Am I ready to shun and shame anyone that doesn't? Do I claim to really understand how a fetus, or what a fetus wants or feels? I mean, no living thing wants to die. An amoeba doesn't want to die. But when it comes to ethics, I don't base my ethics on an elusive idea of a soul being given to a fetus at or a zygote at conception, but rather I take into consideration my ethics things that are real, things like pain and suffering, and I think that's what really counts. And honestly, as much as a conservative, I can say the same thing, that the minute you lost your freedom to choose, the minute you opened your legs to a stranger or someone that wouldn't be there, or someone you didn't want to have a kid with, or someone who was using you, or something that was a fling or whatever, that was your freedom, and that was the day that ended. And I do believe strongly in that people should face the consequences of their actions. But do we really want a kid to be a consequence? Do we really want a kid to have to suffer and live all the shit that they would live in that context, simply because their parents fucked up or their parent fucked up? When I was thinking of pro-life and pro-abortion for the first time, my immediate reaction was protectiveness over the kid. And it was very different than the conservative protectiveness over the kid, which was the protectiveness of supposedly the life of the kid itself. And for me, I was never thinking of the rights of the woman, the right of the woman to choose what to do with her body. I was thinking of that kid and what would be of that kid and what would happen to that kid. And the fact that I wouldn't want a kid to be born to a woman that didn't want him. I think that's terrible. I think it's one of the worst things you could ever live through. And those things don't leave you, when you grow up as a kid like that. But that was my first opinion, and that's where it came from. And to this day, I think abortion should be more of a conversation about that child, or that potential child, than the rights of a mother. Because at the end of the day, unless they were raped, they did make a decision that day. Again, it's complicated. There's context. There are things to be understood. And it is confusing and it is stressful. I think at the end of the day, we all want the same things. Or maybe we don't. I don't know. I want what's best for the kid. But sometimes you gotta look beyond yourself and realize that what's best for the kid is not to keep them alive. And what's best for some people is not to keep them alive. Like people who are on their deathbeds. Sometimes it's better to pull the plug so they don't have to live with other things. And sometimes they can't speak for themselves, and you have to make that decision because you know better than them right now. Sometimes it is benevolent and kind to take a life. And I think there is a criticism that is somewhat valid about conservatives and how they so want to protect life and they so want to um, protect babies, and yet they say nothing for when that for after that baby is born. And I think what I'm saying is I'm not saying that conservatives should that don't believe in abortion should pay to take care of the kids that um, are born in those contexts. What I do think it should happen is that conservatives should look at the other side of giving birth, of the birth canal, is that they should seriously think of what happens to a kid when they are born and they are put up for adoption or put into foster care, or when they grow up without a father, or when they grew up with a mother that thinks of them as a mistake, or with a mother that sees the face of their rapist in their child's eyes every day. I want you to think of what happens to a kid like that, because I think it's important. And I think, if anything, it's the most important part of this whole conversation. I've talked way too much. I hope I've answered your question. I hope it's been satisfying. And yeah, all in all, I hope I answered the question. I'll see you.